Okay. Could you please tell me your first and last name?
Okay, my first name is Kenneth. The last name is Clegg, C-L-E-G-G.
Okay. So now, could you tell me your first and last name and where and when you were born?
Kenneth Clegg. I was born in Valley Junction, Iowa, 724 8th Street, my grandmother's home. And I was born 9 days before my dad left for overseas, World War I.
And what year was that?
1918,
And your birthday?
July 12th.
Okay. So you were born right before your dad left
Right.
at your grandma's house.
I'm sorry.
Were you born at home?
Well, in my grandmother's home, yes. My dad and mother hadn't moved up to a place of their own because he knew that he was going to be going to the service soon.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one sister. She's deceased. She passed away in 2002. I think she was 82 years old.
She older or younger sister?
She was younger, 2 years and 2 months younger than me.
And so what town did you grow up in?
Well, I lived in Westemore, or Valley Junction, until 1929, and my parents decided they was going to make a living raising chickens in southern Missouri, and they got hit with a drought, and the economy collapsed, and we lived on chicken and fish for 2.5 years. It was a great place to live, but very poor place to make a living.
So you remember the Great Depression?
I remember what?
The Great Depression?
Oh, I sure do, you bet.
What was it like?
Well, it was like a dime would buy you almost anything those days. And they were hard to come by, those dimes were. Later on, when we moved back to Iowa, my first job was in a grocery store, and I started out, I worked 7 to 6, 5 days a week, and 7 till 9 on Saturdays for $12.50 a week, and I got a promotion after a few months to $15, and I thought that was pretty good those days. Anyhow, I saved enough money to buy my first car, paid $35 for it.
Do you remember what kind of car it was?
The Model A Ford, 1929.
So growing up, when you were younger, did you have to help out a lot?
Well, yeah, I helped out quite a bit. I did the normal chores around the house, mowed the lawn and cleaned the drive and that sort of thing. It was it made you appreciate every little thing you had. That Depression did.
Ask him about hunting and fishing.
Okay.
See a reflection in there.
Only now I can tell a colonel that he needs to quiet down. Okay. Ken, when you were younger, did you do any hunting or fishing?
My dad was a great outdoorsman, and I learned at a young age, well, particularly fishing, but he took me hunting when I was a teenager too, and I enjoyed that all my life, and both of my sons enjoy it too.
What did you enjoy about it?
Oh, I enjoyed being outdoors, the weather, catching fish, and hunting birds, rabbits. I've hunted just about everything. Ducks, geese, deer, antelope. And I enjoyed shooting too, trap and skeet and rifle, and I was a pretty good marksman when I went in the service. And I remember first time I was on the rifle range, they had a program where you did 10 shots rapid fire from prone position, and the sergeant, our sergeant, he was behind me, and he says, "Be sure you don't get in too big of a hurry." Well, I finished probably while the other guys were loading the second clip, and he was really going to get on me, and the target came up, and I had 10 bullseyes. And he just shook his head and walked away.
So, where did you go to school?
I went to Lincoln grade school in Valley Junction. Then we moved to Missouri. I went to a Hollister, Missouri public school for I think about 2 years. Then we moved back to Iowa, and when I came back, I was West Des Moines then, and I went to junior high school in Valley Junior High School, and I graduated from Valley Junction High School in January 1937.
Okay, and so you graduated high school. Did you join the service right away?
No. The Depression was on then, and I was first I worked in a grocery store. It was a little family-owned store just 2 doors away from where we lived, and he had a daughter that was still in high school. As she graduated, I lost my job. She took the job. So then I went to work for Spencer Chevrolet in West Des Moines, washing cars and that sort of thing, cleaning up. And that lasted about, I think 2 years. Maybe not quite that long, 1.5 years. And then I did various things and had a pickup truck that I used to do anything that I could make a buck with. After that, I registered for the draft in October of 1940, and I had a fairly low number, so I discontinued to try to make a living, or best I could, until I took my first examination for the draft in September, and I think it was late September, and I knew when Japs bombed Pearl Harbor that it wasn't going to be long. And we went up to Minnesota to my sister's place for Christmas, and while we were up there, I got a letter that was forwarded from the draft board, and I reported, I think, the first time was, I think, December, no, it was January 17th. That's when I reported for my draft examination, and I got 10 days leave, and I was drafted the 28th, I believe, 27th, but didn't get officially drafted until the next day. That was at Fort Des Moines.
And what year was that?
1942.
Do you remember, before Pearl Harbor, ever hearing about the war?
Oh, it was in the news from about 1939, when the conflict started over in Europe, and of course there was news from the war of Japs in China before that, and but the war in Europe it was the main event.
How about Pearl Harbor? Do you remember hearing about that?
I was quail hunting that day with, I was working at Home Oil Company, a little independent oil distributor down on Southeast 6th. And the three guys that I worked with, one of them was from Seymour, Iowa. And we were going down there quail hunting that day, and I remember I shot a mink that day, and the game warden stopped us on the way home, and I thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble, because you weren't supposed to shoot that kind of an animal. Anyhow, I knew I'd get a few bucks out of the hide, because I knew a fur buyer. And I don't think he really knew the game laws, that warden, because he let us go. Didn't find us, and I was tickled to that.
And how did you find out about Pearl Harbor then?
Well, when we got home that evening, just before we got home, he turned on the car radio, and they were talking about that, and we wondered, what the heck is that, you know? And of course, there wasn't any TV those days, so everything was by radio or by the newspaper.
So when you heard about Pearl Harbor, did that make you want to join the service?
That made me know that I was going to be going pretty quick. And it took then till January 28th to get me. Things don't move as fast in the military as they do some other places.
So you were drafted in 1942 at Fort Des Moines.
That's where I was inducted.
Inducted.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then what?
Then I went to basic training, and when I left, I thought I'd worked. I forgot to mention that I'd worked out at what's that one down in Missouri?
Leonard Wood.
Well, I worked when they were building for Fort Leonard Wood. And I said, I don't care where they send me, just don't send me down there. They sent me to a worse place down at Camp Walters, which is Mineral Wells, Texas.
So what did you do at Fort Leonard Wood?
I helped build the barracks, and I was a carpenter's helper. And I nailed on siding mostly. And I remember before they give us a job, they send you through a clinic and you had to get shots. And I got a diphtheria vaccination, and it never had taken before, and I'd had it a couple times. But boy, I had a goose egg under my arm that I couldn't raise my hand any higher than that to drive nails.
So, but you weren't in the service when you were at Fort Leonard Wood. That was just doing odd jobs.
That was basic training, and in the preliminary examination they give you, they thought I should be. Well, I was mechanically inclined, and they sent me to an automotive school down there, and we went. Half of the group went, I think, 7 weeks to automotive training, and then they cut the basic training to condense it down to 7 weeks. So it was at Fort Leonard Wood for 14 weeks, and then they divided the group up into several different categories, and I was sent to San Luis Obispo, California, Camp San Luis, and to the 159th Infantry, and that was a California National Guard outfit. And I remember they when they passed out the weapons, every 11th man got a BAR.
What's a BAR?
A Browning automatic rifle, weighed about 17 pounds with the bipod, and I carried that thing all over the hills of San Luis Obispo. It was a dependable weapon, and I was glad when I got rid of it. I didn't have to use it. But later on, when I was with an ordnance company, I had an experience with one of them. We were before every operation, you test every weapons. I was with an ordnance company then, and the first sergeant, I said, I had a tag on it that says "runaway gun," and I says, "This thing been fixed?" He says, "Oh yeah, they all been fixed." So I put a magazine, 20 rounds in it offhand. I was going to shoot 3 or 4 rounds, and I let go of the trigger, and it wouldn't stop. and the thing wound up like that. I was glad it didn't have more ammunition. I'd have probably shot myself. Anyhow, that's just one of the things that happens.
When you were done in California, then where did you go?
Well, we went to desert maneuvers first out in
Fort Ord.
North of Bakersfield. I'm trying to remember the name of it.
Is it Fort Ord?
Fort
Where?
Ord. Ord.
Ord?
Fort Ord.
No, this is before then.
But it was desert training?
Well, no, that was later too.
Okay.
The first stage was Antelope Valley, they called it, and it was we were still 7th Division was still a motorized division at that time, and most of the maneuvers were done with half tracks and other military vehicles, and I'm trying to remember. It was hot, and they wanted you to exist on a canteen of water a day. And you'd drink that before 9 o'clock in the morning. And the water was terrible. It was in Lister bags, and they so much chlorine in there that you had to hold your nose while you drank it. Yeah.
So,
And I remember they had a fire out there in the grass in that area, and they used these half tracks to circle around it and put the fire out. Hot, smoky, dusty.
so what was your job?
Well, I was still in training then, and I really didn't have a job, but they were preparing me to be an automotive mechanic, or trucks and jeeps and weapons carriers and that sort of thing. After those that first issue of desert maneuvers was over, we went back to San Luis Obispo, Camp San Luis Obispo, and I was then transferred to the 7th Quartermaster, and then we moved to Fort Ord, and we worked in the automotive shop there, and we were getting ready for another maneuver at the real desert maneuvers, and our first stop was at Goffs, California, which is north of trying to remember the name of that town, right on the river. It'll come to me, but
That's okay. Let's talk a little bit about after you were done with your training and it was time. Did you go overseas?
well, they sent me from these desert maneuvers down. We maneuvered all over Needles area, California, Desert Center, Rice, Goffs. Goffs is where we started, and that lasted from, and that was not in the coolest time of the year either. We got there in August, and after we'd maneuvered for 2 months, why they sent me to and a few other guys took some vehicles back to a base near San Diego, and I went from there to back to Ord, and then was transferred to a school down in San Antonio, Texas, Norm Oil Ordnance Base, and that's where I was going through a school for a little more technical automotive repair procedures. And before that school finished, they wired and said, report back, the division's been alerted. And I wired back for a delay en route because everybody else got a furlough after the maneuvers, and I didn't get one. And it says, request denied, report back immediately. And there were 4 of us down there, and from the same outfit, and we got our orders and took the train back to Los Angeles, then back to Ord. And we started, after we got back, they had changed the division from a motorized division to an infantry division. And so we started amphibious training, and I saw a landing craft for the first time and got a ride on a few of them. We took I remember our first trip was out in Monterey Bay, and going to land, and there was some pretty high waves, and they tore up a couple landing craft, and they canceled that. So they canceled that operation, and then just shortly afterwards they put us on a ship, and we went down to Catalina Island, and or not Catalina, but there's another one off the coast of California. I can't remember those names anymore, but anyhow, nothing on this island but goats. And they shelled that like a real invasion, and we made a landing there. And the next one was over at Oceanside, just north of San Diego, near a Marine base there. And we landed and slept on the beach, and I remember I had 2 blankets, and this was in the winter months, I think February. I never was any colder in my life than sleeping on that beach. And a buddy of mine, we put all our blankets together and tried to use each other to keep warm, and still, I don't think slept 20 minutes the whole night. Anyhow, that's one of the experiences I remember. And we, as soon as those maneuvers were over, we went back to Fort Ord, and I was probably there about 2 or 3 weeks and got put on an advanced detail to load the ships for overseas. And I was, there was about 20 of us slept on board this ship, and it was a World War I ship operated by Merchant Marine, and it had a Navy gun crew on board, and we just come and go from the ship as you please, and some of the guys kind of messed that up, and and they sent us up to a military camp in the bay up there. It was a permanent base. I can't remember the name, but they'd take us from a launch and take us back and forth to the ship. That probably 10 days, I guess, and then we were ready to go. On 15th of April, 1942, we sailed. And I remember going under the Golden Gate Bridge. I thought, boy, I wonder if I ever see that again, you know. And the next thing I remember was hitting the ground swells out of San Francisco, and they were the biggest I ever saw. You'd be 1 minute, you'd be way up here, and the ship next to you'd be way down there. Next minute, he's up there, and you're down here. And that's as closest I ever came to getting seasick.
But you didn't get seasick?
No, I didn't get seasick. Never been seasick or airsick in my life, thank the Lord.
Were there other people that got seasick?
Oh, yes, there were, and particularly when they got on a landing craft. We used to call that feeding the gulls.
I believe it. So how long did it take to get from San Francisco to where you were going?
Well, we went up the inner passage, and I think there was 3 ships and 2 DEs and a blimp or a dirigible, and we after we left the inner passageway, our first stop was Kodiak, and I can't remember if it was between there or between Kodiak and Dutch Harbor. The 2 DEs, you could hear them make that noise, like beep, 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 and they start really going, and they both shot a bunch of depth charges, and they said they thought they had an oil slick, but they lost contact with the sub anyhow. And the next stop was Dutch Harbor, and they decided we'd been on that ship long enough, and they need a little exercise, so they took us off the ship, and with your pack, I don't know, my pack probably weighed 10, 15 pounds, and your rifle and other gear, but when we were on the hike, we came across a little stream, and you took a break, you know, and I looked down, there was a bear track about that big around, and I said to the sergeant, I said, what do you do? What do we do if we see this? You beat him to death with your rifle, but because they didn't give us any ammunition at all. And I thought that was hard to imagine. Anyway, after Kodiak, we went to Dutch Harbor, and that had just been one of the first places that the Japs, or about the only place they bombed in the Aleutians. And no, it was Dutch Harbor they bombed, and Adak. The next stop was a place that the military had. Well, the Navy had a lot of airplanes. I should have thought about all this stuff
Oh, it's
before
not a big deal at all.
You're doing good, Dad.
Yeah.
Huh?
You're doing good.
Anyhow, I had a cousin that was there on Adak. And I didn't know it at that time, but I got a letter from him, and he was in an anti-aircraft defense position there, and later on, when we stopped back on the way back from that too, I called him and called his organization on the military phones were pretty antique at that time, and anyhow, they got him to the phone, and I talked to him, and he got off duty and came down to the dock, and we got to visit. And he told me about his experiences there, and he said, "Boy, I'll sure be glad to get out of this place." And I said, if you're lucky, you stay right where you are. But in just a short time later, he got sent back home on a furlough, and 6 weeks later he was in Germany in the infantry. And he had some pretty harrowing experiences. Anyhow, that's a different story. From Adak, we went to Attu for the invasion there, and they'd planned to make the invasion, I think, week 10 days before the weather was good enough to do it, and that was the most miserable place I think I've ever seen in my life. It was cold, snow, wet. It was a desolate. The only thing on that island was the blue foxes, and I think somebody, maybe the Russians, put them there.
What was that invasion like?
The date of the invasion?
No, what was it like?
Well, it was in two parts. One part was at Holt's Bay, that's on the kind of the northeast side of the island, and the Massacre Bay, where I went ashore, was on the east. And you got, there wasn't much of a beach there, and the only vehicles that went ashore were tracked vehicles, so they could go on that tundra. And I was sure glad I got out of the infantry when we went there, because I think that was the toughest operation in the Pacific. And they expected to take that island in 3 or 4 days, and it took almost a month. And there were more cases of trench foot and weather-related hospitalizations than enemy caused. But
And what was the name of this island?
Attu.
And they were desert equipment in the tundra.
Okay, that's what I haven't heard of cold weather yet.
Yeah.
So it was cold because it was up north.
Well, it not severe cold like we get here in the wintertime, but it got down to about 20 degrees, and with that moisture, that really goes through you. And the sad thing was that the issue of clothing we had was not suitable for that operation, and in fact General Brown got busted over that, and he was a 2-star general, and he busted him down to a colonel. So we did get an issue of Arctic clothing after the operation was over. And I got an extra issue, and I carried them all the way to the Philippines before I decided I wasn't going to be able to get them home.
So, what happened next?
What's that?
What happened next?
Well, after...
Oh, I'll fix that. Hold on 1 second. Whenever you're ready, go ahead and start.
Where'd we end up?
Well, let's talk about maybe coming up to the beach, the actual assault. Do you remember details about that?
Well, there wasn't any assault at the beach.
Okay.
In fact, in all the invasions that I was on, there was only they didn't try to defend the beaches. They had their emplacements
Well, maybe you
already
could
built.
maybe you could tell me why that beach was important and who you were fighting against.
What's that
The
now?
island Attu?
Attu?
Why was it important for you?
Well, the Japs hadn't been there that long. They'd only been there, I think, slightly less than a year before we invaded. That was the only U.S. territory that they ever took outside of the Philippines. That wasn't a U.S. territory at that time, as I remember. Anyhow, they had their defenses on the other side of the island at Holt's Bay, and that's not an easy place to build defenses either. Everything is it was a desolate, remote, miserable place to be.
Did you see any combat?
Yeah.
Can you tell me a story, maybe?
Well, I was lucky at two. I drove a cat with had an A-frame on it to unload heavy stuff off a landing craft, and I got up to the combat area, close to combat areas, a few times that way. And one time, two cats that were taking supplies to the front lines, going around the edge of this lake, and one of them went over and had two guys on the cat, and one of them made it, but the other one, he learned how to swim in a hurry, and the other one had never learned how to swim, and he went down with the cat. And I took a diver and his equipment, and a buddy of mine had another cat, because at Tundra you had to have two. If you go, one of them stuck, you'd winch it out with the other one. And we went up there and winched out that cat, and the guy that drowned had only been in the water probably less than 12 hours, and he was as black as his shirt almost. And that water was probably 33 or 4 or 5 degrees, not any warmer than that. The closest I came to combat there was on the last, when they knew the Japs knew that they were beaten, they made their final banzai, and the 7th Medics had their hospital, temporary hospital, set up, and the patients were in pup tents, and the Japs got in there and they bayoneted a bunch of those guys in the pup tents, and they were making a charge up this hill, and the infantry, and I think it was the 17th, had a defensive position set up on top, just back from the crest of this mountain, and they came up the hill, and they had the machine guns there, and they annihilated a bunch of them, and the others knew they weren't going to make it. They committed hara-kiri by holding a hand grenade against their chest, and that was a sight that was never photographed, as far as I know. And they made their final stand there, and that was, they probably got within just a few hundred yards of where we were bivouacked on, and we never bivouacked back from the beach very far, because that terrain was just impossible to negotiate. And one of the things that caused so many casualties there was they issued a leather blucher boot. It was and it had a steel hobnail in for a heel, and that's what caused so many cases of trench foot. They give you dubbin it's a grease like an animal fat grease, and say if you rub the boots with that, it'll make them waterproof. For about 15 minutes, I think. Anyway.
Tell me about, you said you were on other assaults?
I was on.
More assault on the beach?
Oh,
many are
there was no assault on the beach.
Okay. But you went to 4 islands?
4 invasions.
Invasions?
Yeah, I went from there back to Hawaii. And on the way, we stopped at Attu, or Adak, and that's when I called my cousin, and he came down. Then we went. I think from Adak they told us we're going to Hawaii. Everybody was betting whether you'd go home or going back to the States or not. And I think we got paid after a stop in Adak. And
what is Adak? What is that?
It's one of the Aleutian Islands. It's the Navy or the Air Force tried to build a base there so that they could bomb Kiska, where the Japs also had another base. Well, before we left Adak, part of the division was on the invasion of Kiska, and we were on standby and just stayed where we were, and they before that invasion, I remember they really increased security there at Adak, and we had we mounted a 50 caliber right outside of our tent, right on the beach, and we stood guard 24 hours a day because they'd sighted a ship, Jap ship, and they thought they might be trying to reinvade, and so all the anti-aircraft guns and stuff would have been our defense. But that was, they were evacuating Kiska rather than taking going to reinvade Attu. From there we went to Hawaii, and at Oahu, and it was supposed to be a relaxing period there, and get the division back in shape again, because there was a number of casualties from the line companies, particularly due to frostbite and had enemy casualties. Anyhow, there was approximately 3,000 Japs on Adak, or on Attu, and I think they took 17 prisoners. And friend of mine was in the MPs, and he was he helped guard those prisoners while they took them to, I think they took them to Dutch Harbor. And he said they got pretty riotous, and somebody shot one of them, and I guess that quieted them down a little bit.
So after Attu, you went to Hawaii to rest and recuperate,
Yeah.
and then
Well, we were there till about mid-January 1944. Then we went to Kwajalein. That's in the Marshall Islands, and the division was assigned to Kwajalein, and Marines were kind of a dual operation. The Marines were on Roy, and there was in the Kwajalein operation, there was the main island of Kwajalein and about 4 or 5 other smaller islands. And the first step was taking one of the smaller islands to get our artillery, so we'd had land-based artillery for close-in fire support. And I remember waking up to a terrible noise, and I jumped up and run up on deck, and there was a battleship off our stern about, I'd suppose 400 or 500 yards. But he was firing almost right over the top of us. And that island was only about, the highest point was about 6 feet above sea level when tide was up. And later on, when we was on shore, they couldn't believe the number of duds from naval gunfire, and that was because they were firing on such a flat trajectory. And we had a bomb disposal outfit attached to our company, and their job was to take care of them. Anyhow, I remember there was I think it was an 8-inch Navy shell there, and they had to get it out of there. So they strapped some TMT charges around it and hollered fire, and I was back quite a ways, and I remember when that went off, that projectile went up in the air, must have been 100 feet or better. And boy, everybody was really taking cover, and it hit and bounced up 3 or 4 more times and never did go up. Anyhow, that's where I was attached to the 32nd Infantry, and they split our company up into groups that would be with different outfits, and I got with a heavy weapons company. I can't remember the name of it. Maybe it was D Company, or anyway, I probably would have remembered it for a few years, but we were ahead of the, our foxhole was ahead of the heavy machine guns, and there the Japs were all in blockhouses, pillboxes, that sort of thing, and the infantry had to root them out. But getting back to the day of the invasion, thought those 18-inch, 16-inch Navy guns were powerful, make a lot of noise, but there were about a dozen B-24s came over, and they dropped 2,000 pounders, and we were anchored probably, I'd guess, mile and a half offshore. And when one of those 2,000 pounders went off, boy, the ship just shook like that. There was a lot of airplanes involved there. There's several carriers and dive bombers and strafing and that sort of thing. I went ashore, I guess, about that started shortly after daylight, and I think I went ashore about 10 o'clock, something like that. And we were direct support for this heavy weapons company, and one of the guys was a small arms, and one was artillery, and that was me. And the big artillery is on different islands, but we had pack howitzers, 75s, and one of the blockhouses, they couldn't break it, so they had the Navy bring over a 155 from one of the other islands, and they've got this thing about, I'd say, 75 yards from the blockhouse, and they didn't have any armor-piercing ammunition, so they just wouldn't put a fuse in there, and that fired that thing about 3 or 4 times, and they finally knocked a hole in it. And combat engineers got a drum of aviation gas up there, and they pulled the plug on it and let it drain into this blockhouse, and a guy threw a grenade in there, and woof, you know, they didn't think anything could possibly live through that. And I think the 13 Japs came up 20 minutes later, and they were one of the few to surrender. And another thing that I remember there is that I don't think I've slept over 10 minutes at a time the whole 8 days we were there. I think it was 7 or 8 days, but the operation lasted about 5. And
and that is Kwajalein?
Yeah, Kwajalein Atoll.
What would you do when you were not on an operation?
I did everything just about. Let me think here.
Did you impersonate an officer on Hawaii so you could play golf?
Yeah, that one of. Well, when we got back from Kwajalein, we went to the old part of
Wow.
Schofield Barracks, and they had one of the old concrete permanent garrison buildings, and the bunks there, they had 2x4 racks, and you'd set a cot in down bottom and then one up on top. And the thing I remember is, didn't take me just about 2 days to find out that there are bed bugs in there. And because I'm allergic to them, man, they break out on me. And I went down to the captain and I said, boy, you got to do something there. I said, them got bed bugs. And I showed him where. He says, oh, that can't be. And I said, well, it took about a couple more days, and I raised so much cane over this that they finally took all those old racks out and took them out in the courtyard and set them on fire and burned them up. And you just slip closer together. They put all the bunks or the beds on the floor instead of having them elevated like that. Anyhow, that's funny how you remember things like that and don't remember other things.
Well, tell me about your when you went golfing.
Well, that's the only thing to do at Schofield, really. They did have a golf course there. And the other thing was that you were limited to be off base only during daylight hours. I think it was 6 o'clock you had to be back on base. So any passes to Honolulu were daytime passes. But they had a golf course there on Schofield, and they also had landing mat on that, and they had fighters there for the early part of the war, and it was a pretty neat camouflage deal because you never knew there was a runway there. You'd be playing, and they'd blow the siren, and you had to get off the runway, and they had P-39 Air Cobras there, and the safety rules were nothing like they are today. Anyhow, they'd blow the siren, they'd land or take off, and then you go ahead and play. And if your ball was out in the landing net, you just had to. It was a steel mesh that was laid right over top the grass, and it was perfectly camouflaged.
Was everyone allowed to golf or only officers?
No, that was for enlisted men. The officers had their course too.
Did you ever play that officer course?
Well, the one, the Wildlife Golf and Country Club is just south of Waikiki, and I found out about it, and so I borrowed. It's supposed to be officers only, and I borrowed a field jacket from one of our first lieutenants, real good guy, and went down there, and I come to find out that the guy that was a pro there and running the shop was a assistant to a pro that we had here in Des Moines Elmer shot, and he was at Olympia Fields in Chicago, and he was his assistant so I had it made from then on. I could go down there, and it cost you $1, and you could use a member's set of clubs, donate them, and a pair of shoes if you could find a pair that fits you. Golf shoes were a real premium because GI shoes aren't very good to play golf in. And I played there several times. And
How long were you in Hawaii before you went to the Philippines then, to Leyte?
well, we were from after Kwajalein, we got back in February, and we were in Schofield until about mid or late August. And when we left Oahu or Schofield, they didn't tell us where we were going. And we made a stop at Eniwetok, and they had a beer pub there. Anyhow, this lieutenant that let me use his field jacket, he was in charge of the group that I was in. He says, "How much money you guys got?" And I think you're supposed to only supposed to take $10 with you when you left Oahu. But I had a few extra bucks, and I know others did too. And we pitched in, and I think there were 17 of us or something like that. And he bought beer for 80 some. So I had one of those, not a barracks bag, but that's one with a strap on it. And,
Duffel bag?
And I had about 2 cases of beer in there, I think. Anyhow, I had some of it when we got to the Philippines yet, but it was about Carling's green GI colored beer cans, and out of those that I had, there must have been about 4 empty cans in there. Carling's really shafted the government there. Because I'm sure they paid for full ones for all, you know.
What did you do in the Philippines then once you got there?
Well, we I should have.
The invasion, what day was it?
October 20th, 1944.
Tell me about that.
There was some action at the beach there. Nothing real close to the beach, but they were back a few hundred feet or maybe yards. But I landed at Dulog on Leyte. That's about 8-10 miles south of Tacloban, and that's where MacArthur news shows him waiting ashore. They said it was the first day, but it was about a week later. And
and what was your job on that day?
I'm trying to remember. Well, I had a tool truck, and before we went to the Philippines, this friend of mine, he was a machinist. We bought about $50 worth of soup and stuff. We were going to eat good on this operation, and I think we maybe had a can of piece out of that stash, and about the third or fourth night we were there, I was working on a 105 artillery piece and had the trails spread out. I dug a foxhole in there because we were getting quite a bit of, the Japs were pretty active with their airplanes. And I saw a lot of air action in Leyte. The night the Jap fleet broke through and was coming down the chute, they called it. The Navy small boat craft were coming ashore, and the Navy guys were digging in on the beach. And that was when you could see the gunfire from the Jap ships, and we were sitting there. This friend, my buddy, we had a 5-gallon water can with a pump on it, and we'd been ashore about 4 or 5 days, and we decided we were going to take a shower before we sacked out. And Dist had taken the showers and sitting there on the trails of that gun smoking a cigarette, and I heard this airplane, and they were busy unloading on the beach, and they had lights on, and there was an ammunition dump there that was in the middle of all the supplies, and I heard this airplane. I looked up, and there was a moon there, and it just happened that airplane went right between the moon and I could see it was a twin engine. I said to my buddy, I says, we ain't got any twin engines flying around down here. I says, I want to get in a foxhole. And about that time, boy, I heard that screaming noise of this bomb, and I dove in that foxhole, and that bomb went off. I imagined it picked me up over the bottom of that foxhole, and I opened my eyes, and I was in the blast area. It was red everywhere. And then the trash started falling, sand, dirt, and anyhow, it left our company in a disarray, and this buddy tried to move that truck, and it wouldn't start. And we had to get out of there because the bomb ignited some gasoline or diesel fuel, and that got into small arms, 50 caliber, and tracers going everywhere. And pretty soon it got the artillery, the clusters of 105, there's 96 105 rounds in a pallet. And them pallets were going off right and left, and that shrapnel was flying every direction. So I said, gotta get out of here. And we started up and we found an old Jap pillbox. And there was about, I guess, 10 guys in that. And that's where I spent that night. And I was one of the only guys that had a rifle and a helmet. And so one of the guys in the pillbox was an officer. I can't remember, but I don't think it was the same guy that gave me the field jacket. But I probably stayed awake a couple hours, and that's when the flash is offshore, and next thing I know, somebody's shaking me. I'd went to sleep, and it's bad news. But anyway, nothing was made of that. Next morning, first thing I remember is just a short ways, probably 2 blocks or less from where our truck was. That's when we found out that the shrapnel had cut off one of the ground cables to the battery, and that's why the truck wouldn't start.
Oh.
But that's where all our groceries went. The truck burned up.
So when you were done at Leyte, because this all happened on Leyte, right?
Leyte wasn't an overnight operation. That went from October 20th until mid-March, and they were still wiping up. The Japs, I saw a lot of air activity there, and one of the guys was down to the beach, and he came back, he says, "Hey, I just saw Richard Bong," and said you wouldn't have, he was looking for his gear too. They'd lost his bags. Anyway, he put on quite an air show for us there one day. He and his wingman accounted for a lot of Jap planes there. In fact, one day he came back from a mission, and we were stationed at Bay on the west side of the island at that time, and no, this was before Bay. We were at San Pablo Airfield, is where we were based close to that, and we got our equipment. We were using captured Japanese equipment because we lost all of ours in that bombing. Anyway,
Perfect timing.
Here you go, wet your whistle.
What's
We could
cold?
We could take a break for a second. Okay, go ahead.
One of the things that I remember after we'd moved to the west side of Lady Island, a little town called Bay, and we'd taken over an old bus depot there for our shops and small arms and automotive and that sort of thing. And one decent resident that was there, officers took that over for their area, and they put a radar upstairs, the top floor of that house, and they could detect enemy airplanes taking off from Cebu, which was across the bay, probably 50 miles from where we were, maybe 50, 60 miles. Anyhow, they could determine where exactly just about where they came from and almost what kind of an airplane it was. But we saw a lot of enemy air action there. And one case was the last stronghold of the Japs was at Ormoc, which was probably 20 miles north of where we were. And they brought a fleet of shallow draft boats like LCIs, LSTs, and that sort of thing. And they were unescorted because it was shallow water there. And the Japs knew that, or guessed it, or found out we were coming anyway, and they sent out a bunch of planes to try to bomb these small boats or ships. And we sent air defense up too, P-47s and P-38s. And I don't recall any Navy aircraft at that time, but we had air defense by the Air Force. And the Navy kept their aircraft on the carriers at that time. Anyhow, as soon as the jet planes started appearing, our fighters got there. And I saw a lot of airplanes get shot down, both Japanese and U.S. There was a lot of airplanes there. I'd guess in the hundreds. And one of ours was a P-47, and he was shot up pretty bad, and he landed in a camote patch at sweet potatoes, and he walked away from it. And I saw the pilot. He probably kid 21 years old, hadn't even shaved yet, I don't think. And while we were there at Bay, washing machine Charlie used to come over every night about right after dark, and he'd wait for somebody to shoot at him. He'd see any light at all, he'd try to bomb that spot. And so they got I think it was a weapons carrier with a 450 caliber machine guns mounted on the back of that thing, and they went a few hundred yards from where we were, and they set up, and he came over. They started firing at him, and sure enough, he would come around, and they got this weapons carrier. As soon as they fired, they moved out of there. And he dropped his bomb where he thought they were, you know, probably pretty close to where they had been, because those guys were uncanny about that. But that was a tough campaign for us, because we lost everything to start with, and soon as that was over, in fact, it wasn't over, but the thing I remember is they gave us shots for bubonic plague, and we knew we were going somewhere. Well, it turned out got on a LST, and the whole convoy was LSTs, and we're heading for Okinawa, and we thought we were going to make it because a typhoon came, and they had to turn the convoy headed into the typhoon, because those shallow draft boats don't have any keel on them. And I remember the night before we got there, here's this ship all lit up, and it was a hospital ship.
Hope.
What was the name of it?
Hope. The Hope, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't the Hope. It was
Mercy?
no. I didn't think I'd ever forget that name. Anyhow, next time I saw that was 1970, something off the coast of Florida. We were fishing down there with a buddy of mine, and they were towing it to Texas for scrap. It was a big hulk. It was a big ship. Anyway, no defense on the beaches at Kadena either, or I mean at Okinawa either. And the landing took place, I'd say, early morning, 7, 8 o'clock, something like that, and I went ashore. I had a machine shop truck, and that's how I went from Lady to Okinawa. Had a bunk in between in the middle. I can't remember the benches and lathe on one side. And anyway, we got hung up on the beach.
On the core.
The LST did, and they wanted us to unload, and this lieutenant that I really liked, the guy that gave me the field jacket, he said, no, we can't unload because it was potholes in that coral, and they said, okay, tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, something like, the tide will be the highest it'll be for 6 months. And so we stayed there, and that was a worst night of my life as far as because there were about 3 or 4 LSTs in a row stuck on that coral, and here come forward Jap airplanes, and this one that was closest to me, he dove and dropped, and I could see when he let the bomb go off the airplane, and it hit in the coral probably, less than, I'd say 30, 40 yards from where I was. And I heard it hit, and it bounced up in the air, and the only protection on that was underneath my truck. And I'd seen it bounce up, and I thought, boy, if that thing goes off, it didn't, or I wouldn't be here. Anyway, trying to remember what
was the date?
The date, that was April 1st, 1945. April Fool's Day. It was Easter.
All on the same day.
Easter Sunday. And like I said, no, they didn't defend the beach at all, but there was like four divisions, 2 divisions of Marines on the left, and there was a little river there that separated them, and 2 divisions of Army on the right. And the 7th Division, which was my division, was just south of the river, and we're just offshore from Kadena Airfield. And the first night after I did get ashore, I slept I remember sleeping in a barley field, and boy, I woke up, I was itching every place. Fleas, and
You want some water?
they expected fleas, I guess. Yeah, I
Here you go.
guess I better drown that down a little.
Oh.
Mhm.
So you got fleas.
Yeah. Anyhow, after I got the flea powder, I remember sprinkling it
Here, let me check
about a
that.
half a can around your neck, and you got that going or not?
Yep.
You'll edit it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyhow, I take my shoes off that night, and man, that must have had 100 fleas in each shoe. They like bed bugs. I'm allergic to them. Okinawa is a pretty good sized island. It's probably 60 miles long, and the north side was the most distant, but the Japs decided they had very little defense up there
Why
So-
why didn't they have any defenses?
because they had all their fortifications on the south end of the island. And they one of the things that brought all of the Japs down to that end of the island is we made a fake amphibious landing the day before the real invasion. And they think that's why they were, but Kadena airstrip was just south of that river, and the island is probably about 6 miles wide there. And the first day the 7th made it almost across the island, but then they turned south and looked like easy going there for first few days. But then they hit the first line of defense. And we stayed. Our first camp was in a well, it was a Japanese garrison, and they had concrete surface there for some reason. I can't remember what, but we set that up for our shop. And we were at a main intersection of the roads there, and we were probably there for a couple of weeks or so. Anyway, I'm trying to remember. Should have done this a few years ago.
Oh, it's fine. You have a lot of details, so don't worry about if you miss
Yeah,
one.
anyway.
Well, let me ask you a question about Okinawa. Once you reached the first line of defense, you said the infantry started
Yeah.
having a hard time. How long, or did you end up taking Okinawa?
That was the toughest battle in the Pacific, and the most casualties. I think that we probably suffered more casualties there than any other place. They had terrific defensive positions set up. And our first move there was down to Yanabaru. That's on the east side of the island, and close. They had a line across from Yanabaru to Shuri to Naha. Naha is on the west coast, and that was the biggest city, but it was completely destroyed. And they had they had defensive positions set up to cover that Naha Shuri Yanabaru line. And I remember seeing tanks. Thought they were parked up there, but they were all knocked out by they had terrific anti-tank weapons set up. And I happened to be up there one day, and I looked in one of our Sherman tanks. One of the things that I noticed, a shell had hit the turret, and it plowed a furrow the whole length of that turret and never bounced away. It was a 77 dual-purpose anti-aircraft, anti-tank gun. And from our first, one of the things that I remember, the first place we were was the enemy artillery fire that we encountered. They'd every morning when the airplanes started warming up, they'd wheel out these guns out of these caves, and they'd fire a few rounds and then put the gun away, and they kept from getting knocked out that way. But one thing that I remember too is while we were still at our first area, they had a weapons carrier with radio equipment in it, with radio direction finder, and they placed them across the island, and even a couple of ships had them. And when that gun would fire, they'd all take a fix and were bisected. The next morning, every artillery piece on the island was zeroed in on that spot, and when they wheeled it out, the island shook. All the artillery went off, and Navy too, and they had a direct hit or two on it, and anyhow they put it out of action. But it was like a 10-inch big gun, and that's some of the things that we heard. That and others is and one of the other things that I remember is all of the friendly aircraft, anti-aircraft fire, the duds that didn't go off on airburst would, first thing it hit coming down, tree limb or whatever, it bang, it'd go. And I got to see quite a bit of that. And remember one day we was having lunch with a K ration, and and 3 or 4 of us sitting in a group there, and one of those Navy anti-aircraft shells hit a tree, probably 100 yards away from where we were, but a piece of shrapnel was spinning in the dirt, and guy picked it up, boy, he threw it down, it was red hot. There was a lot of air activity in Okinawa. And it was surprising how far they could go through all that anti-aircraft fire.
How long were you on Okinawa?
I was there from the Easter, April 1st, till after the war was ended. I left there. Well, I'd have got home sooner because the point system had come out, and I had enough points to come home. And the war ended. The ship that I was supposed to come home on, they took the division, part of the division, to Korea. 7th Division was sent from Okinawa to Korea, and they stayed there until a year or so, I guess, and then they moved to Japan, and when 1950 they were sent back to Korea with their guns loaded. But
well, do you remember hearing that the war was over and what was going on at that time?
oh yeah, we knew it the first night that we got the rumor came through. It looked like the 4th of July. Every aircraft gun on the island was, the Navy too was shooting up in the air, and they had to I forget how they stopped it, but it went on for quite a while.
How did you hear? Did someone tell you, or?
Well, I can't really remember how we heard it, but it probably had to be radio.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a few radios. We had one in the CP, and I remember I was tuning that radio once in, I think this was after the war ended, because I stayed there till another 6 weeks waiting for transportation. And I was tuning this radio, and I thought, what's the matter with me? And I looked up, and the light bulb was going back and forth like that, and it was an earthquake. And we also heard there was a typhoon coming, and so I think there's about 6 guys in my tent, and we got some old axles that were broken and drove them in for tent stakes. Said that'll hold it won't blow away. And I was sleeping close to the center of the tent, and when that thing got really going, it split the bridge pole, and it was that long because the grain, and it stuck that thing down the ground about that far, just about 2 feet from my bunk, and I thought, boy, that'd be a heck of a way to get ended. Get harpooned with that.
After the war was over.
Yeah, that was after the war was over.
That'd be bad.
Yeah. One of the things that I remember about when we left Kwajalein was that the landing craft next to ours, the guys were going up this rope ladder to get back on ship. There must have been about 6 or 8 of them on there, and that net broke, and one guy lit right across he was coming down back end, his back first, and he hit on the edge of that landing craft. Another guy hit in the water, and that was it. He never came back up. I thought, boy, that's a heck of a way to get it after going through these were infantry guys too.
What were those landing craft called? What was their official name?
What was that?
The landing craft, what were they called?
LVBP, I think, or
LCVP? Landing craft, vehicle, and personnel?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's the ones that had the ramp on the first, but the ones we went to at 2 on didn't even have the ramps in them. They were the
Landing barge?
old peacetime barges, I guess.
Well, tell me about after you were done at Okinawa. Did you go straight home and were you done with your service?
Well, I was, let's see, after, when they told us our ship was out there, I knew that the food on board ship wouldn't be very good, so I got a hold of a bunch of K rations. And I had about a half a barracks bag full. But when we said our ship was there, and we went down to the beach, we had to sit there from daylight in the morning till almost dark in the evening, and before the transportation out to the ship was available. So I pulled out one of those, and guys said, "Where'd you get that? Where'd you get that?" I gave them all away, but about 3 or 4. And the ship that came home on, the General Man, we called it the USS Malnutrition. It fed 2 meals a day, 6 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. And it wasn't any banquet on either occasion. But all I'd have was a cup of coffee in the morning, and I can't remember the evening, but after it was, they said that that ship had been hauling South American troops and hadn't been able to get new provisions.
How long were you on that ship?
Well, it's another thing. They told us it'd go 20 knots or something like that. It went about 15. We made the Great Circle route. We went from Okinawa almost to the Aleutians, and then back down to we were supposed to dock in Seattle, and there wasn't room, so we went down to Tacoma, and they sent us to Fort Lewis, Washington. And from there, well, they got an issue of clothing there. And from there we went on a troop train to supposed to be to Camp Riley, Kansas, but it was what do they call it? Like when sickness.
Quarantine?
It was,
Quarantine? Quarantine?
yeah, it was quarantine, so I went to Fort Logan, Colorado, and that's an old cavalry post. And I remember I made reservations on the Rocket they said be discharged the next morning, and I went through the discharge, and they said go in that room and get your decorations. And I says, do I have to? Because I had a reservation on that train for an hour later. That was the only one today. And they said, no, you don't have to. So rushed out the door, and another guy and I grabbed a cab and said, we got a 1 o'clock train departure. Can you make it? And he says, yep, we'll sure try. And we said, we'll make it worth your while. I think we give him $20 a piece or something like that. And he got us there. The thing I remember is the MP chicken guys getting on the train. He grabbed my arm and I said, that's not a GI watch. And he was gathering them for himself, I bet you. I know how that went. Anyhow, made it home in one piece. And I'd hate to go through it again, but there's just some good memories and a lot of them that not so good.
Well, I think that's it.
Well, I hope. I sure can't remember like I could a few years ago.